I can't, of who bought what in the auction.
But you found it.
Apparently it was the only hard copy we had.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Well, and she asked him before, do you want it? He said, no.
There's just one that.
I found the one for the silent auction in the trash can. And so I was going through all the other trash cans, but they had food on top of them.
But you told us to begin with silent auction, not to even bother listing stuff.
Yeah. We'll know for next year.
Yeah, I already told them I want to be part of the postmortem.
So we are coming into Genesis 4 and 5. And I did print it out this week because we're going to read it together. And I have it on the screen, but I remembered it's a little hard to see on the screen.
You have old eyes here.
Yes.
And I'm really close to it. It is so big when you're like 2 feet from it. So before we look at it, all right, my question is what stands out to you? But I just want to commend John is reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. So you're only in tablet 3. How far is that in the story?
Gilgamesh with his friend are getting ready to go and fight this evil enemy. And they're going to the queen. And
it's a lot like Heracles. They go in all these trials and battles.
If you've never read an epic, it's kind of funny that the way they write and all that. So yeah. And if anyone's interested, it is on. Let me tell you where it was. It was on. It's on the internet. It's free.
It's on Wikipedia too.
Is it? Okay, I didn't get it from that. I got it. Let's see. I probably can't get it. Here it is. Epic of Gilgamesh. It's on ancienttext.org.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I will send that out in the link.
Yeah.
And
you're talking about the different versions, and it'll say next 4 sentences lost, and now we're doing the another version. Filling in. 'Cause we think this is where it goes. So it's of interest.
So John mentioned one part. If you remember when we talked about Gilgamesh last week in Genesis 2 and 3, when Gilgamesh's friend who was formed out of the clay, a woman comes and teaches him how to be a man, is what I said. And I didn't go into as much detail. He spends 10 days with a prostitute, and she teaches him how to be civilized, but not the way we would think of it. So,
it says she opened her robe and showed off her voluptuousness.
Oh.
I thought, what a word! What word was that in Sumerian?
I'll say it's been fun reading some of these stories and then filtering them.
Yeah, a PG version.
Well, I'm just looking here at this one. It said, and the human knew Eve. In my Bible, it says the man had intercourse with his wife.
Yeah. So the word that's used is no. What translation do you have? NIV?
But I'm just saying that.
New Jerusalem.
They cleaned this up, but mine just said.
Well, and the actual Hebrew is that they knew each other.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, so it's not the word for sex, it's the word for knowing, which has an idea of intimacy.
Oh, really? Oh, well, that's funny that they translated it as intercourse.
And
you got the X-rated Bible.
I guess.
Did anything else stand out to you? I'm curious, did anyone read the genealogy?
Yeah. Yes.
Everybody was really old.
Yeah.
Everyone's really old.
And especially old before they had kids. 120 years.
Yeah.
But towards the end,
they were patient.
Live as long.
And it gets, especially when we get into the genealogy in chapter 10, I think is the next one we'll see, or 11.
Well, even in chapter 5, it got lower amounts of years.
930, 912, 905, 910, 8, 97, 962, 365, 969, 779.
Did you write them all?
I did.
I wrote them all.
You told me
You
to
wrote
pay
them out too.
attention
Wow,
to the
okay.
numbers.
You ask us to pay attention to the numbers
Exactly.
and what it says about each person.
Exactly.
I'm just really impressed. Well, did anything stand out to you?
They were old.
There were a lot of similar names. I mean, a lot of repeat names.
A lot of repeat names, yeah.
I want to know in a general sense. I'm not as interested in details, so maybe I shouldn't even be here, but what is the significance of a genealogy going all the way back? Because a lot of those people, do we ever hear about them again?
No.
But it's all leading up
Well,
to Jesus.
in other genealogies.
Isn't it all leading up to Jesus?
It's so in Matthew it quotes back, and some of these names will pop up again. Matthew's gospel opens with the genealogy, and it leads them from Adam to Abraham to David.
Right, but all of this with all the detail, that was my question.
It-
When
Yeah,
this was
Just at this
written,
point, can we trust the detail?
we'll answer some of those as we
I
walk
think
through
it's
this.
trying to give validity.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily buy that, but it's interesting.
So
It's
we're
being difficult.
I'll give a
How
preview.
different.
This list of genealogies and things like this in the ancient Near East was a way that they would tell stories.
Mhm.
And so the list that we have, we're going to compare it to a Sumerian list. And what we're actually going to find is our people don't live actually as long. The Sumerian kings lived for thousands or tens of thousands of years. But it's a way, and sometimes the numbers are specific. At the end, we're going to look at a timeline that's going to add up all of these ages, and you get really beautiful Hebrew numbers between each and everything. Oh, wait, did I put those in? Oh, actually, I forgot. I think I forgot to put it in the PowerPoint. I have the pictures. I'll show you the pictures. I may have forgotten to put it in the PowerPoint.
when these were written, they weren't part of the Bible. They were just written individually. So it was important to the person at the time to talk about the ancestors. But these are all just separate people, all different times.
And actually, Genesis 5 is written very, very late.
Oh.
And so we'll go ahead and move to our next. So here's our little overview. And you named some of these, so I'm happy. If you remember way back in the first and the second week, we did the introduction into kind of Genesis and reading scripture. And we introduced this idea of doublets, that a lot of stories in Genesis are repeated. And that's a weird writing mechanism. That is not normal. So oftentimes when we read texts in the ancient Near East, they're all very, very similar. No one does doublets like this. It's really, really strange. And that's part of why when we look at Genesis, we'll look at it and say, well, there's this priestly and non-priestly source. And it seems that when Israel came back from Babylon and they're kind of rebuilding their religion and it gets more formalized, they put these two traditions together and they line them up. And you want to include both sides, and so they lay them all each beside each other. And that's kind of the version of Genesis that we get today. But they're both laid beside each other. Chapter 1 in Genesis was priestly. And if you remember when we looked at Genesis 1, we even counted up the amount of words or how many sentences there were. And everything was this variable of 7. It was really poetic. And we had lines going everywhere across. And it was just really structured, poetic text. And it was late Hebrew. It's really structured in the way it's written. Well, Genesis 2 through 4, all of these have been non-priestly. And if you remember, even when we went to chapter 2, it was all of a sudden we went to prose. We had been in really high poetry, and it just changed to narrative. And it looked very different. We're going to see the same change today when we're reading 4 and 5. And what's really exciting is that 4 and 5 are a doublet with the two genealogies. So in Genesis 4, we have a separate genealogy. And this one is non-priestly. In Genesis 5, this one is priestly. And what stands out about it is the numbers are going to be more significant. And they add more numbers. So in Genesis 5, they're going to tell you at this age they had kids. At this age they died. There's more numbers and it seems to be more important. And those are the ones when we add them up, we start to get kind of some special arrangements going on. And then the other thing is genealogies are a really important way of storytelling. So having a genealogy and having ages, it does communicate something special. And oftentimes those numbers will relate to other stories that we might miss because we don't know those stories. We're going to point to a few of them, but we won't go into too much detail just because a genealogy can get boring. But this list that you have, it might have 10 generations. It can be referencing 8 different stories in it. And so each of those names is going to hold some significance when this story is being told. So we're just going to look at a few of those and kind of dip our toes and get them wet. The next priestly genealogy, I can't remember, it's either Genesis 10 or 11. All the other genealogies seem to not quite be as structured as chapter 5 is. And so this one kind of stands out as being a bit unique here when we read it. Before we jump, is there any like other overview points that kind of stood out to you while reading this? Okay. Oh. All right, so we are going to read it. I put almost all of Genesis 4 and 5. Although this last paragraph here, and the paragraphs correlate to how I have them on the slides. The last paragraph, when there's big dots, I skipped over some of the genealogy that we're not going to reference or really go into detail on, just to save us time while reading. But Donna, if you would want to read until you feel so moved to stop reading.
Genesis 45, Robert Alter. And the human knew Eve, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have got me a man with the Lord. And she bore as well his brother Abel. And Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offerings, but he did not regard Cain and his offerings. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you incensed? Why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well or whether you do not, as at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you is its longing, but you will rule over it. And Cain said to Abel his brother, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him.
And the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And so, cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it will no longer give you its strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is too great to bear. Now that you have driven me this day from the soil, and I must hide from your presence, I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me.
And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, so that whoever found him would not slay him. And Cain went out from the Lord's presence and dwelled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Then he became the builder of a city, and called the name of the city, like his son's name, Enoch.
And Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad begot, oh my goodness, how do you pronounce that?
Mahujael.
Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech, and Lamech took him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal, and he was the first of tent dwellers with livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the first of all who played on the lyre and the pipe. As for Zillah, she bore Tibble. I would get this back. Who forged every tool of copper and iron, and the sister of Tibble Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hearken my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. For a man have I slain from my womb, a boy from my bruising. For sevenfold Cain is avenged, and Lamech 70 and 7. And Adam again knew his wife, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth, as to say, God has granted me another seed in place of Abel, for Cain has killed him. As for Seth, to him too a son was born, and he called his name Enoch. It was then that the name of the Lord was first invoked.
This is the book of the lineage of Adam. On the day God created the human, in the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And he blessed them and called their name humankind on the day they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and he begot in his likeness by his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he begot Seth were 800 years. And he begot sons and daughters. And all the days Adam lived for 930 years. Then he died.
And Seth lived 105 years, and he begot Enoch.
A lot of other people in between there. They all died.
Then he died. And Enoch lived 65 years, and he begot Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. And all the days of Lamech were 777.
Oh. Have I missed something? Hold on. Oh, no, keep going. Okay, my slides were just confused.
And
Sorry.
all the days of Lamech were 777 years. Then he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and he besought Shem, Ham, and Joseph.
So he had triplets?
Maybe, or he had something. Or had 3 sons. So, when we read that, now that we've kind of read it, maybe again in this other version, before we move in, did anything stick out to you reading it with fresh ears?
Why did Lamech have 2 wives? No one else.
He was a bad, bad boy. This is one of the first songs here. So if you remember in Genesis 1, we saw the first poem in the Bible. This is the first song in the Bible. Might have been a little chant. People might have sung. Kind of interesting.
In,
How do you know?
they
That's what my commentary said, and I believed it.
they list the names of Adam's and Eve's progeny, but all the others they only mention the firstborn and then his sons and daughters until Noah.
And
Until
maybe
Noah.
not firstborns. They could have skipped compared to some other genealogies. It seems to be the important one.
Well, but so now Noah is the first one where they actually name all of the offspring. So to me that means he's the next big guy.
Yes. Yeah.
Adam.
These are like a connecting point here to get us to the next big player.
I wasn't unclear where it says, for sevenfold Cain was avenged. And for Lamech, 70 and 7. How are they avenged? I don't understand.
So if Cain was evil times 7, Lamech is evil times 77.
Ah,
He's a bad, bad guy.
okay.
And because remember, Cain kills Abel because he got jealous. Lamech just kills a young boy because he got a bruise from him. So he's a bad, bad boy. And he married 2 people. That's bad too.
Okay, so 2 things that I don't understand. The Lord, up in the first paragraph, the Lord did not regard Cain and his offering. So I don't understand why God would do that. I mean, that doesn't sound like the kind of God.
So
I
we're
like
going to
this,
come
I
to
like
that here in a
this,
second.
and I don't like this.
This is the God of the Old Testament.
Well, okay.
Pretty
The other thing
pickle.
is, I've heard of the mark of Cain, and I always thought that meant that was something bad, but it says here that the Lord set his mark upon Cain so that whoever found him would not slay him. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. So that gets something interesting right here. We see this idea that all death is bad. And so even though Cain has killed, God still doesn't want Cain to die. And so there's this, it's almost saying, if you kill this one, I will do worse to you. It's kind of the avenging of 7 times to the person.
But if you've done something bad, isn't it a worse punishment to have to live with it?
Could be.
Yeah.
I think I'd rather live than be
And where
dead.
did the
I'm not
wives,
done.
where did the wives for
Something
Cain come from?
Where did what?
Where did the wives for Cain come from?
So we're gonna touch on. So that's it. I have a last slide on this. That's the honorable mentions that I couldn't figure out how to get in my main 4 points. There seems to be other people just walking around. I've always found it really interesting how people get really stuck on, like, if you're reading this kind of literally, that there's Adam and Eve and that's all the ones that it comes from. Because already in this story, it seems pretty clear that there would have been just other people living around.
Exactly.
And so what you could think of as Genesis is we are not looking at all of the world. We're this zoomed in view on what God is doing in a particular people. And that people is leading up to Israel. But more and more, we're getting more focused in until we get into the family of Abraham. And even Abraham, now we're going to zoom in on Isaac. And then on Isaac, we're going to zoom in on Jacob. And then we're going to zoom in even further into the tribe of Judah as we kind of move along. And so instead of thinking of this as like some kind of wide expanse, we're zooming in on like where the big action is taking place. What I really like about thinking of it like that, when Melchizedek, if you remember that priest who serves the Most High God, El Elyon, he seems to worship God, and we hear nothing else about him. I find that to be so exciting, this idea that God is working everywhere around us, and I'm only aware of what God's doing here with me, but that doesn't mean God's not everywhere else doing God's thing. I find that to just be so cool, and I think this is just another example of that. We're here, and we're doing this project with God now, but God's working everywhere.
I like that explanation because
Yeah, me too.
because there are people that ask this question. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't believe every literal word in here, but there are people that do, and they ask those questions. So I'm glad to have that
Yeah.
answer. We're zooming in on just this little part.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can you tell me what the sentence means when the Lord says to Cain, whether you offer well or whether not, at the 10th plant sin crouches?
Yeah, let me read it in this other translation.
You'll rule over it.
So that's in verse 6 and 7 in Genesis 4. I don't put the verse numbers in here because I don't want them to distract us. So I'm going to read it in the NRSV. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." There is this kind of paternal relationship God has with Cain. So God is not this harsh and hates Cain. There's this pastoral and fatherly care going on for Cain here. We're going to first deal with the story of Cain, but I want to just kind of give an overview of the points that I want to cover. The first one, I'm just going to call it the moral view. Both in this story, but also in the genealogy, there is a lot of moral lessons in this. The first and the most obvious is in the story of Cain and Abel. There's other ways of looking at the story of Cain and Abel. To me, though, the moral view that we're going to touch on in just a second is the main lesson to go with. And keep in mind, when this is written, it's written after Judaism is already a religion. It's written after a temple has already been built. It's written after sacrifices are already a thing. And so keep that in mind. Who this was written for already knows about sacrifices and how sacrifices work. We're also going to look at a social view. We're going to do our comparative myth because we're going to try to do that each time. And then we're going to compare and contrast chapter 4 and 5. We're only going to do that just a little bit, but we're going to look kind of slightly at the different authors. And if we have time, I have some honorable mentions at the end. But let's look at the moral points in this story. What is weightier, animals or plants? Animals. How come?
Well,
They move.
blood sacrifice.
There's blood. Life is in the blood. So there's this life force in animals that is not in plants.
They move around.
They move around, so there's a little bit more work in taking care of an animal than there is of a plant. it's really obvious when we kind of think about it. An animal is worth a lot more than a plant. And so when we read this story, sometimes we try to be sympathetic to Cain. And it is good to have sympathy, but that's not the point of this story. Because for its readers, and even to us, there's a very clear distinction in offering up a plant and offering up an animal. And if you want to even think of another example, when you kill an animal, that animal produces nothing else. And so a comparison of offering fruit or plants would be digging up the apple tree that you planted 10 years ago. Or a comparison would be offering the cheese from the animal rather than the animal itself in Abel's sense. So there's this very clear difference in the offerings that Cain and Abel have. In Cain's sense, it's kind of the leftovers. And you almost get this idea that it's kind of not the best of what Cain could have offered. And so he's almost doing the ritual to get through the ritual rather than to actually give thanks to God. With Abel's sense, it seems very clear that there is good intentions and wanting to give everything to God. So in this story, kind of the very clear moral point is when you are worshiping God, is it a ritualized kind of get through the thing but your heart's not in it? Or is it more of your intention is fully involved in what you're doing? So in that sense, we get to see Cain's heart even more if it's not clear that he's filled with all of this jealousy that he doesn't get the type of reception acknowledgement, that he is going after. So it's good to have sympathy and want to sympathize with Cain, but the kind of clear point of this story is, what is your offering to God? Are you going to be more like Cain, or are you going to be more like Abel? As we kind of delve into these genealogies, those 2 points are going to get wider and wider, because we're going to see the descendants of Cain, so those who live like Cain, and we're going to see those descendants of Seth, who is like a second Abel, for those who follow kind of this righteous path, and they're going to be very clearly different. And they kind of culminate in Enoch as the good guy. He's so good, he walks with God. Or Lamech, he's so evil, he kills kids. And so which one will you be? That's kind of the moral point. And this is why I love the story of Cain and Abel. This idea of brothers and like sibling rivalry is one we can all kind of associate with. So there's something that feels really familiar when you read this, because you can always imagine going back to being a kid and how selfish you are as a kid, and kind of you want to get your parents' approval. I like this story.
Kind of a precursor to the prodigal son.
And it's also, we're going to see these 2 brothers more and more and more throughout, even just Jacob and Esau and others. The other thing, remember, this audience already knows what sacrifices are. So in the sacrificial system, if you're wanting to make a true, what we would think of as a sacrifice, it's always an animal, even if it has to be a dove or something like that. Giving plants or this excess, those are free will offerings. But this is written once a sacrificial system's already in place. And so these are very different types of sacrifices. Do you need a cough drop? Oh, that was a sneeze.
I will take a cough drop if you have a
Lemon or honey?
scratching. Thank you.
Does that make sense in this?
Yeah.
Is there other ways this story means something to you?
Well, I feel that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain was a tiller of the ground. They both gave what they were working on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
One worked with the animals and one worked with the ground, and they both gave what was the best they could possibly give in their current situation.
Yeah. But you also get this idea kind of, if Cain wanted to do a fuller one, he could give his whole tree rather than like the apples of the tree.
Okay.
If that does that make sense? Kind of like a comparison would be Abel gave the cheese from the lamb instead of the lamb itself.
Do we know why one became a farmer and one plant versus animal?
So we're going to touch on that in a second with some of this as a social commentary. That's our next slide. this last thing I just want to remember, what we're going to continue to see as we read this, it's an undoing of creation. So if you remember in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, this is the ideal world. God created a good world. Everything is in harmony with one another. Even the word for man and woman's not used. It's just human. Everything is good. Humanity is very good. Everyone's at peace and equal and friends. In Genesis 3, we see an undoing of relationships. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the snake. Everything starts to get worse. And now we're going to continue to see this undoing of creation. These first few chapters of Genesis, this is what we're going to see. Creation started, but continually we're going to see an undoing. And God's going to kind of keep giving everyone a chance. And then we're going to see when it just gets so bad, God has to intervene in a big way. We're going to see that next week or maybe the week after. But continually, everything gets worse and worse and worse. When you don't live according to this way of walking with God, things don't turn out well. That's the point that we're seeing in these stories. Everything is being undone from the way God intended. This, to me, is my favorite way of looking at this. It's a very clear moral lesson for us about following God. There is, though, another way. Oh, I was going to play you a video. Okay. In my aim to always have a short video each week, I found a 40-second kids video that I want to play for you. Whoa, where did it go? Oh, here it is. That was weird.
The faithful Hall of Fame, Hebrews 11. Abel.
Can y'all hear this?
So this is Abel. Abel is in the Hall of Fame because he was famous for his faith and he gave his best to God. Now, God created the whole earth. God created the first man, whose name was Adam. Adam and Eve had two sons, named Cain and Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain and Abel wanted to show their love and thanks to God, so they brought him an offering. Abel gave the strongest and fattest sheep he had. God was very happy with Abel. God said that Abel was righteous because he brought him the very best that he had to give.
There we go. That's my video for the week.
I can understand that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to play that to reinforce that there seems to be a really clear difference. So it's good to have sympathy for Cain, but the point of the story is they're not the same. And that makes sense to the readers. Okay, there's another way of looking at this, and that's this idea of a social view of reading this. So if you remember last week, we talked about a social view of Genesis 2 and 3, and it seems to be having this comparison of a hunter-gatherer kind of society and then an agrarian society. And I put up another picture of an agrarian society because you'll notice something. Everyone's working all day long, and it's very centralized. And that's kind of the way that we have noticed that civilization developed, is that one city would kind of conquer another city, and that conquered city would be the ones that developed the land. And then there was like a ruling class. And it's very structured. If you remember, we showed that kind of pyramid picture of the way it worked in Egypt. And for this story, there was probably that Israel was under Egypt's influence. And so we're going to kind of see throughout, there's this almost calling back to the good old days when we were more independent and we could kind of live a more simple life, as you know, we kind of feel the same way today. But we're going to see a similar idea here, and that is that this difference in being a hunter and being a farmer, so Cain is the farmer, Abel is the hunter, and it seems to kind of long for the days when we can just be hunters and not be farmers of the land, because oftentimes farmers were those who were conquered. were being taken advantage of. I think this is an interesting way of reading this story, is this social commentary. But my favorite way, again, it's that moral lesson. It's an undoing of creation. But I think it's important to keep this in mind as well. And I thought that y'all might find it interesting to know what their names mean. Because you've remember we looked at the names here, they're more like titles. So Adam is the word for man. Eve is source of life or life giver. Abel, it's the same word used in Ecclesiastes for vain. And there's almost this idea when he's introduced, you know he's about to die. Because he's just an empty placeholder to kind of stand in the way here. But it also seems to be that Abel is where we get the word herdsman from. And Cain is the word for create. And it's where we get the word for metal worker. There was actually a tribe in Israel that had a very similar root word as this. And so some commentators think that this story is kind of referencing this one tribe that was the metal workers. They were the creators. But from this word metal worker, it ends up turning into the word for farmer. And I'm not really sure how the etymology of that works. But there we go. These words, they're placeholders in their titles for what they're going to become. That's the social view. I don't want to think too much about that, but I do want to just keep in mind that as society and civilization gets bigger, it often takes advantage of other people. And as we're reading through Genesis, we're going to keep coming back to this idea of being taken advantage of. Because Israel was most often the one that got taken advantage of. Whether that was by Egypt, whether that was by Assyria, whether that was by Babylon. And that becomes more and more clear to us, especially when we get into the flood narrative and after that. There's very clear references to this being under oppression. And especially we're going to see that in the book of Exodus as well. Do you like this idea of looking at it with this social lens? Does that connect with you at all?
Yes.
Gives it context.
Yeah. Some commentators think that's the main view. To me, I really stick more to that moral view, but this is a new way of looking at it for me, and it's kind of added a deeper layer as I've read through Genesis. I want to look at our comparative myth. And the first I just want to say is that two brother stories are really prevalent stories. And they're used throughout, even going back to Rome, the two brothers that founded Rome. This is a pretty common trope that's going to be used. And oftentimes when we have two brother stories, they'll be used to talk about kind of an ancestral two brothers, and the descendants will be two opposing people groups that are related. So when we get to Esau and Jacob, we're going to kind of see that the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were right next door. And it was almost a way of making fun of them, calling them lesser. And so two brother stories become really important. But the other thing that's really fun about the Cain and Abel story is it plays directly off these Sumerian myths. And I find it just fun. So the name of one, it's the courtship of Enon and Dumazid. And so there's a shepherd, and he's named Dumazed. So he's kind of like Abel. And there's also a farmer named Enkidu. And they are both competing for the affection of this goddess. And it ends up that the shepherd wins out over the other. And the story of Cain and Abel, it sounds very, very similar to this story. What's also interesting is there's another story that's kind of the opposite of this story. And it's the one where it's called Elil Chooses the Farmer God. So that's the name of the other story. And in this one, there's a shepherd god called Enish, and there's a farmer god, Inton. And they both have this dispute, and so they go to their kind of pantheon head named Enlil. And he rules in favor of the farmer god over this dispute. What's interesting in these two stories, in one of them the farmer wins, and in one of them the shepherd wins. And these are both very popular stories here in Samaria. And so when this story of Cain and Abel comes in, what we're going to find is that they're kind of answering in favor of the hunters, and so or of the shepherds. And so one thing to remember when we're reading these, none of these are written in a vacuum. And oftentimes we'll find that there's two camps. And sometimes Genesis will answer to their contemporaries in favor of one opinion over the other. Jesus does this when he teaches parables in the New Testament. So there was two big camps. And oftentimes when Jesus is giving an answer in a parable, like when people would pose a question to him, he answers in favor of one of those other ones. So I don't want to spend too much time with our comparativeness, but I did want to show you a picture. So this is the tablet that tells us about the story of the courtship of Enon and Dumazid. And so you can see them two here kind of opposing each other and going against each other. And this is the other story, the one of Enlil. And so here's Enlil. He's one of the four main gods in this Sumerian pantheon. And he's like the god of wind, I think, if I remember correctly. And so here they are kind of coming to worship him. He's the one sitting over here. But there's this other way that Genesis 4 and 5 are interacting with Sumeria. And I referenced this in the beginning. And it's something we call a Sumerian king list. So this is a king list. And if you remember what we talked about before, writing was very expensive. So here someone had to carve it into a clay tablet. You also had papyrus and things like that, but we don't have those anymore because they dissolved. They don't keep very well. But writing was really expensive. And so anytime something is written and it's really old, it means it's really special. Especially when it's put on tablets like this. And what's really interesting, I don't want to go here yet, is in this Sumerian king list, these kings, they're very godlike kings. And that's almost kind of the picture that we get about Adam and Adam's descendants. They're made in the image of God. They were directly created from God. They're godlike in that sense. They're special. They're not normal. But in the Sumerian king list, it's interesting is because they live thousands or tens of thousands of years. And so you get this idea about the Sumerian kings that they are great and lord over other humans. And they're almost undefeatable in how powerful they are. And so in the Genesis story, humans don't live as long. And it's not quite limiting, but it's very poignant that none of them make 1,000. And so it is very limited. And so those numbers stand out quite a bit. No one makes it to even 1,000. That would sound short when you're kind of comparing this to these other ones. But there's one more cool thing about the genealogy when we compare it into Sumeria, and that is Enoch. So if you remember when we're reading in our genealogy, there's a guy named Enoch, and then he walks with God and he is no more. Do we have a special thought?
I made note of that.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened to him?
Yeah, we don't know. He just goes away. But there is another interesting story in Sumeria that's very similar, and it's this guy with a long name, Enlil-Medurnek, and I don't know how to say that. But one thing to keep in mind, so Enoch, this is in Genesis 5, he's the 7th generation from Adam. And if you remember when we talked about the number 7, 7 is special. It's kind of the perfect number. It's the ideal number. Well, we get the idea in this genealogy, Enoch is who you're supposed to be like. So he is the one that we want to live like as a people. And the description for Enoch is he walked with God. And so the moral lesson we're seeing in this genealogy is you are supposed to walk with God. Live close to God, talk with God. Our God is a personal God. You can be friends with God as you walk with God. Enoch did it, so can you. But what's also interesting is this story of Enoch, it sounds very similar to the Sumerian story of that guy's name. And in that story, it's before the flood, and so it's a special time. And he is taken up before the gods, Shamsha and Adad. I'm not very familiar with this story, so I do not know their names. And he's granted this like supernatural wisdom, essentially. He is brought up before the gods, and he's granted not quite supernatural abilities, but he's gifted with wisdom, discerning right and wrong, and knowing how to live and what to do in life. And what's really fascinating is that he's brought before the sun god. And how many days are in a year?
365.
365. And how many days was Enoch on earth? 365. So there's these very clear parallels throughout this story. And so what kind of, we get this idea with Enoch. When you walk with God, there's this wise way of living. Because when you hear the story of Enoch, it goes, oh, I've heard this story before. And there's this idea that you too can walk with God, and we can have the wisdom of God when we do so, and discerning what to do in life. And this is in contrast to Lamech, who's the bad guy. You don't want to be like him. He's evil. He's evil because he married 2 women, and that's not the way you get married. And he's evil because he kills kids, and you don't want to do that either. Be like Enoch, not Lamech. Does that kind of make sense when we look at those? I don't want to spend too much time today on this comparative myth, but I do want to look a little more detail at the genealogies. So I have here a picture of the genealogies, and I'm just going to quickly kind of walk through them. So in Genesis 4, we learn about Adam. So he has Cain as a son. He has Abel. Remember, Abel died, so he's kind of sad. He's that empty, that vain one. And then Seth. And Seth has one son at the very end of the genealogy named Enosh. But Cain has a son named Enoch, and he builds that city. The city is called Enoch. And he has Irad, and he has Methuselah, and he has Methuselah. He has Lamech. Lamech has 2 wives. He has Ada, and she has Jabal and Jubal. They're very similar names. And Zillah, which is Tubal-Cain, and Naamah. This name might sound familiar when we come later into Genesis. But then in Genesis 5, we get this other one, and it's the descendants of Seth. So Adam has Seth. Seth has Enosh. Enosh has Canal. Kenan has Mahalalel, who has Jared, who has Enoch, who has Methuselah, who has Lamech, who has Noah, who has Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What's interesting about these genealogies, some of the names interact and are the same names, and they're used in each one. And if you remember, these are from our 2 different sources. One is from the priestly source. One is from the non-priestly source. One is more structured. One is less so. And in this story, the descendants of Cain were getting more and more descending into chaos of uncreation. And that culminates in Lamech, who's like the epitome of evil. You don't want to be on this side of the genealogy. We want to be on this side, which leads to Noah, who follows God, to Enoch, who follows God. And so that's kind of our point with these 2 genealogies. Some other things I just want to point out. In chapter 4, there is 7 generations. In chapter 5, there's 10 generations. And there's some fun that begins to happen with their numbers. So Lamech lives 777 years. I mean, that's like the golden number that you can be right there. And Enoch is in the 7th generation. And the other special number is that Noah has kids right at 500, which is this nice round number of 1,000. And what we're finding in Genesis 5 is that all of the numbers are a lot more structured. And so there's this poetic part that takes place. But again, the idea is be like Enoch, don't be like Lamech. Is there anything when you read the genealogy that you thought, I'm glad I read that?
No.
Is there anything when you read it that you go, oh, that part stands out? Not even on Enoch and walking with God?
Well, that stood out for me, yeah. 'Cause
Yeah.
he's the only one that got that designation,
No one else gets commentary except him.
right?
When you think of walking with God, what does that mean for you?
That you follow his ways.
Following God's ways?
I think being at peace.
Being at peace. Tell me more about that.
I think it's just like a grounding. You can feel enveloped.
Feeling enveloped. Oh, I like that word.
Where did God take him? Or do we assume that means God killed him? Or
It seems like he kind of goes up to heaven sort of like Elijah, who gets carried up into heaven. Do it?
Jesus did the same thing.
Oh yeah, or like Jesus who ascends, floats up into heaven. But yeah, he walks with God and was no more.
yeah.
That's not very good advertising.
It sounds kind of scary.
Yeah. Well,
That was a popular name too.
Enoch? To be named back here? Or
I mean, it's several times there was someone named Enoch.
oh, there's also a whole book named Enoch. And the Ethiopian church has Enoch as part of their Bible. And there's one other like church that has it as part of their Bible. But the story of Enoch is like, what in the world happened to Enoch? Why was he so special? And how did he get caught up? And it's just an interesting read. I have not read it, but I've read parts of it. Have you seen the movie Noah that came out like 10 years ago?
With Russell Crowe?
Yeah, with Russell Crowe and Emma Watson. Has anyone seen that movie?
Noah?
Yeah, I did.
Was it good?
So I watched it on a plane coming back from Africa, and I only remember half of it. In that movie, though, there's these rock people that are these angels that they were fallen angels because they helped humanity because they loved them, and then they're turned into rock creatures, and then they help Noah get out, and then they're released, and they're called the Watchmen, which is like Jehovah's Witness have the Watchtower. Like that comes from the Book of Enoch. This kind of weird story things. But yeah, a lot of people have speculated who is Enoch and what happened to him. And so there's whole other books written about Enoch that are not in our Bible, that are old. So these are the things we kind of looked at, and we're going to then move to our honorable mentions, which I'm excited we made it into. But I really want to just hold on to this moral thing that we're seeing happening. We are watching uncreation. And so this good world God made, it begins to unfold. Remember Cain and Abel, and remember Lamech and Enoch. Because there's an idea there. You walk two paths, who will you walk after? We walk after Cain, it leads to being Lamech. We walk after Abel and Seth, so the good ones. Then we're like Enoch, walking with God. And what we're going to find as we read through is those drift further and further apart. And you get to walk on one of those. And I just want to point out one last thing, because it pops up with Lamech marrying two people. There is another way of kind of writing with wisdom literature. So sometimes you would say, this thing is good, this thing is bad. And sometimes texts are written like that to teach you what to do. Other times, they describe someone, and they'll describe things about them. And that's a way of teaching you, if you do this, it's not a good thing. So when Lamech describes being married to two people, and he's a bad person, you get this idea, it might not be good to have polygamy.
where does he describe that?
So it mentions that he marries two, and it mentions Lamech being bad.
Where?
It's in Genesis 4,
Okay.
in the Psalm. Let me see what verse it is.
So
Oh,
later,
okay, I was in 5, I get you.
So
Yes, I see Lamech
in verse 23.
in 19, it says Lamech took 2 wives, okay, gotcha.
later, it became more the norm. Jacob had 2.
But what's real? So when we read those stories, Isaac only has one wife, is Rebecca. He has a kind of it's a little more peaceful of a marriage. What we're going to see with Abraham, he has Sarah and Hagar. It gets chaotic really quickly. And we're going to see when the patriarchs have the 2 wives, it never says this is bad, but it describes it as causing problems. And that's another way of kind of writing moral lessons. It might not outright say it, but it'll describe tacky situations that you don't want to be in. And we're kind of seeing a glimpse of that here, referencing polygamy already here from the beginning, that this isn't the way God kind of set things up to live off of.
So Sister Wives isn't really true? But you don't watch that show, do you?
Rachel loves watching this and like the fundamentalist Mormons that have. It's like her one of her hobbies. That is weird. There's some honorable mentions. And did I put the picture? Oh, I didn't have the picture. I'll show you this picture here in a second. So there's this line here talking about Adam, and it says, "In his likeness, by his image." And I just find this interesting. It's a reversal of what happens with God. And so it's kind of continuing on creation, but creation's happening through Adam, but it's the reversed words of what God does. And so instead of being in his image, it's in his likeness. I find that interesting. I just wanted to point that one out. We mentioned this one before, but it seems to be that there's other people around, which I just think is fun. And I want to just call back to that we mentioned in the beginning. What we see in Genesis is this focused view of what God is doing, but that doesn't mean that we're saying God isn't working in other places. Were you here when we mentioned this part? I don't know if you were. So this is kind of when we started out. So we're going to see in Genesis that we're like zoomed in with a microscope on what God is doing in this one family, and this one family leads to Israel. But there's also glimpses that pop up where God is doing other things. The big one is Melchizedek, this priest that follows the Most High God and worships God. He pops up and then he goes away. But there's this whole city that worships the same God. You never hear from them again. So we get this idea that God is working all around you. And we may only know what's happening right here, but here we see there's other people walking around somewhere. Who knows what's going on with them? The other point is, as we're seeing civilization expand, it's getting more and more chaotic. So we're seeing more and more of this uncreation. And there's this idea that civilization kind of destroys what it means to be human. And so sometimes God has to intervene and keep civilization in check. And then this other one. So there is a line that's used, and it says, "And this was the first time the name of God was invoked." Did you remember that line when it popped up? Is that the end of chapter 4, I think?
Yes.
So if you remember way back in the beginning when we talked about the 4 sources. One was Yahwist. So this is the difference in the Yahwist source and the Elohist source, or the priestly source. For the Yahwist source, and we're seeing it in this text in chapter 4, they say God's name was first used, the name Yahweh, way back here before Noah in these days. When you jump into Exodus 6, and for them, that's the Elohist source, God's name isn't used until Moses. He introduces the name Yahweh to Moses first. And so what's interesting about that is we get our 2 authors that are kind of popping up here. One is saying, well, we've known the name Yahweh from the very beginning. And the other is saying, well, we didn't know the name Yahweh all the way until Moses. Not really important for the story, but when we compile our sources, people have different perspectives on God and what they call God, and when God kind of began to interact with humanity. And we're seeing that play out here. And that's part of where we get these different layers that make up Genesis and Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch. If I can figure out my screen, I want to show you a picture. So we will get more detail into this chart here, but this is a timeline if you count up from creation, and there's very specialized numbers that happen between big events. I might send a video that describes this out this week. But here is a more specific one. When we count up when the numbers are happening for creation and the flood. And so these are two different ways that you can count it. But I just want to point out is that there are specialized numbers between each event. And so part of the reason that the genealogies are so long and specific is they're orchestrating the history of Israel as being this large set plan of God in different movements. And each of the numbers that kind of the different stages happen they're special numbers. We'll get into more detail on this part as we move through later. But I just want to kind of touch our toes into this idea now that the numbers are significant. And when you count them up, they're significant in how they play out over all of the Pentateuch when it's laid out together. And if you're really curious about that, I can send a video out about this.
Sure.
Okay. So as we looked at chapters 4 and 5, do you feel excited about Cain and Abel and genealogies?
More than I used to.
More than you used to? Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, it's a different way of telling stories, and I'm kind of glad that we don't really write like that anymore. They make you think, and that can get hard sometimes. My watch just told me goal complete. I'm not sure what I did. I guess I drank enough water. I don't know. As we move next week, we're going to start to go into the flood narrative. So that's in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. I don't know how far we'll make it through. And so let's read 6, 7, and 8. But we might not make it through all of that next week. And we might kind of do like we did the first week where we have a full PowerPoint, but we'll double dip into both sides.
I'll make one comment about genealogy. You know, when you're reading about other people, it's not as fascinating. My daughter did one on our family. And I found out stuff I never, I didn't know kind of where we came from.
Yeah.
And this is going through Ancestry.com. It's not the blood thing where you figure out you're 1/4 Ethiopian or something like that.
Are you related to the Queen of England?
Yeah, no. No, we're not. But we found out that a Christian Dietrich left Munich over to New York, and then they changed the name. Well, I didn't know that. I knew it was and then got to, I don't need to go into it. But I thought it was fascinating, mainly because her father did genealogy of the sailors, from Peter Saylor, and it was easy because the sailors landed in Pennsylvania, didn't move much, so he could go around to all the churches and stuff. He didn't need ancestors.
In all the graveyards.
Yeah, graveyards and Bibles and stuff, and was able to do that. And I read that, and it's when it relates to you, I find it very fascinating. When it relates to others, it's kind of like, who cares?
People want to belong.
Yeah, you want to know where it came from. You want to kind of figure out, and that's what the Bible is. Kind of, where do I fit in all this?
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
This is kind of random. I had an anthropology class in college, and we had to go to a cemetery and remake up the family list of who lived in Pond Gap. In Dry Gap. It's the oldest Methodist church that was in Knox County, and we had to go through and recreate the families, and then you got extra credit if you would use extra sources like old newspapers and things like that to reshape who lived. And it was really sad to me because most of the tombstones were washed away because they were limestone. And I couldn't read them anymore. You had to do like the pencil thing. People want to belong though. And this kind of goes back to, do I have meaning in life? Do I belong here in the world? And are we special, or are we just like a mistake here?
I think
we hope
we belong to the world, but how?
But how?
Yeah, how? Why and how? We know you're here. We can see each other. We can do that. But the meaning behind that, I think, is the fascinating question.
There's something that I'm surprised that you didn't mention.
Oh no!
And that's, am I my brother's keeper? I mean, that's even I've heard of that.
Yeah.
And so I was surprised God didn't answer. Did he?
Are we our brother's keeper? There's a a song that says, "I'll be my brother's keeper, and I'll be my brother's keeper." You know this one? No? Okay, it's on Christian Baptist radio. Yeah, there's an idea, I guess, that we should be our brother's keeper, that we are to care for one another and to look out for one another. So when you ask him, well, where is he? Well, you should know he's your brother.
Well, it's like that story of the 7 brothers that married the wife. That's brother's keeper kind of, isn't it?
Oh, the kinsman redeemer. When they would marry the
The 7
widow,
brothers
yeah.
married the same wife. That's brother's keeper.
That's what they did back in generations back. If your
If they died,
father, husband died, his brother had married his wife.
no. Honest,
What if the brother already had a wife? Does he have 2 wives then, or?
it didn't say that in the Bible.
I think it was married because women back then didn't have a means of
Support.
yeah,
Exactly.
living.
Exactly.
So it was a way of taking care of.
Yeah.
Genealogies, one of my things that I do too. It's fascinating. I'm a science teacher and I was interested in history until I retired and started doing genealogy. Now I can't get enough of history. I want to know what was going on. And from a female's point of view, it was shocking to see all these children all these women had because they didn't have a choice. I mean,
Right.
and 100 years ago, women couldn't own property. I mean, anyway.